I'm Ottmar Edenhofer. I'm professor for the economics of climate change in Berlin, and at the same time I'm the director of the Mercator Institute for Global Commons and Climate Change, and I'm also serving as a chief economist at the Potsdam Institute. My interest in low carbon transition is a very simple one, because whenever we want to avoid dangerous climate change, we have to find a way to depart from the business as usual scenario. And the departure of the business as usual scenario means we have to transform our energy system, our agricultural system, and also our economy. So in that sense, I'm quite interested in transformation and pathways towards transformation. From my point of view, when I started to think about this problem, I started to think about international negotiations. And I thought then about institutional investors and finance ministers. But when I served as a co-chair of IPCC, I make sure that we add a chapter on cities. And it's very interesting to see that within the cities, so there's a lot of potential to, on the one hand, to reduce emissions, but on the other hand, there's a huge challenge for the cities, because many people now are advocating more compact cities, where you bring together the workplace and the flats and make basically city life a little bit denser. But this has a strong implication. So at the same time, land in the cities becomes much more scarcer. And the scarcity of the cities might create a lot of inequality within the cities. You have to deal with that. So some people talking now about property taxes, land taxes, in particular in the broader context, because what we have seen so far over the last 2 decades is an increasing land rent in the cities. So this is a quite interesting experience, that people can do a lot at the community level. They can do a lot of at the level of the municipalities. But at the same time, even at that level, you have to deal with a low carbon future and at the same time with social inequality. This is a quite challenging way, and I would say living in a community, living in a city, is a very vibrant place to reconcile both aspects. I have to say I have a lot of sympathy with grassroots movements, and I would say in Germany we have seen a period of very successful grassroots movements. Think about the anti-nuclear movement. Phasing out nuclear power in Germany wouldn't happen without the grassroots movement. So in that sense, we have seen the enormous success, the enormous effectivity of the grassroots movements. But my feeling is that we are entering a new stage, because more and more it becomes clear that environmental problems are no longer local problems. I would argue in the 80s and in the 90s we have seen a lot of local environmental problems, and grassroots movements have been enormously successful, enormously effective to address this issue. But now we are moving in a new stage. We meanwhile realize that climate change is a global problem. To a certain extent, avoiding deforestation and protecting the Amazonian forest is also largely, at least partially, a global problem. All the other environmental problems around the ocean are global environmental problems. So now I think we are in a phase and a stage where the grassroots movement has to think about to become effective to address these global issues. I have no clear-cut solution for that, but what I can do is formulate the challenge. From my point of view, there was a lot of support, at least in Germany, for promoting and supporting renewables, which was in the very early stage a good thing. But now again, we have to realize that at the global scale, climate policy hasn't been effective so far, because we have seen even an increasing growth of emissions despite of the financial crisis, despite of a lot of mitigation efforts around the globe and also in local communities. We have to take into account this simple fact, and it's even worse. Emissions are not just rising, they are rising because we see now an emerging renaissance of coal. Coal becomes competitive in the power sector in the United States, in India, in China, but also meanwhile in Europe. So from my point of view, there is a strong need on carbon pricing. And carbon pricing will become, from my point of view, not the only one, but at least the most important step to implement effective climate policy. Now, the crucial question is, how can grassroots movements support such a thing? There are a lot of challenges around this. One challenge is that the distributional consequences of carbon taxes and carbon prices. So carbon prices, carbon taxes might damage in particular the low-income households. There is also a distributional issue. So then we have to think about how to complement carbon pricing with income tax reform. These are incredibly complicated things, but nevertheless, I hope that the grassroots movement can take on this challenge. A second challenge is, if the grassroots movement is much more interested now in divestment, I would say divestment can only be a successful policy, a successful movement, if you have in the first place a carbon price. Otherwise, you cannot resolve this issue. So again, from my point of view, there are a lot of interesting entry points, but it is now, from my point of view, the time to bring this different, this different perspectives together. And I would say a grassroots movement which tries to convince the institutional investors to reallocate the investment budget, at the same time to convince the national finance ministers to impose a carbon price, might be something which is a very powerful way towards transformation.